Good afternoon and welcome. Let's get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez and I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Public Policy Institute of California, and I want to thank you for joining us today on Valentine's Day. So happy Valentine's Day. For those of you who brought your special loved one here for the free lunch, you'll still have to do something else, but I appreciate it as a parent of college students. So I appreciate that. And you know who you are, right? For those of you not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento. For today's program, we're going to hear from PPI researcher Dean Bonner, who will present the findings of PPIC's latest statewide survey on Californians and their government. You should have received 3 handouts. One contains highlights from this survey, and there's just the facts piece, one on Californians and transportation, and one on the governor's state budget proposal. The transportation proposal piece is very important, and the governor has announced and the Democrat leaderships have announced that they're hoping to work on a transportation package as early as April. All of these items, as well as the full survey report along with the slide from today's presentations, are available online at ppic.org. We'd very much like to thank the James Irvine Foundation and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this survey, and again, the Irvine Foundation for their support of the lunch we provided. After Dean's presentation, you will have plenty of time for questions and answers, and a few more things before we begin. Later today, you will receive a survey. Oh, there's another example. Please turn off your cell phones, because Dean hates to be interrupted. And finally, we've got a number, and he's, I think they're going to have a new child coming soon. You're going to be interrupted a lot, yes. So he doesn't want to be interrupted here. And finally, we've got a number of upcoming events. Topics include child poverty, water in the San Joaquin Valley, and higher education. Please check them out on our website and sign up for them so you can attend. I'd like to now invite Dean up to the podium for his presentation. Thanks, Dean.
Sorry about that. So thanks for joining me here today on Valentine's Day. We'll kind of go through the PPIC statewide survey that was released last Thursday. And then at the end, we'll take any questions that you may have. So starting off with the mission of the PPIC statewide survey, our goal is to provide timely and relevant nonpartisan data on a number of topics, including political, social, and economic opinions of Californians. We hope that we can improve and inform the state policymaking audience, as well as raise awareness and encourage discussion. We've provided a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates since 1998 by interviewing over 330,000 Californians in over 160 surveys, including general issue surveys, as well as regional surveys. So this survey is funded by the James Irvine Foundation, as well as the PPIC Donor Circle. We'll kind of break it into 2 sections, the federal government section, the state government section. The federal government section will look at the approval ratings and the overall mood of the nation, as well as how Californians feel about a few pertinent issues such as immigration policy, climate change, abortion access, as well as health care. At the state government, we'll look also at the approval ratings and overall mood, in addition to the governor's budget proposal, which includes his transportation proposal, as well as overall opinions when it comes to transportation funding. The survey was conducted from the 22nd to the 31st. It was conducted with 40% landline and 60% cell phone. This is a change for this year. We went from a 50-50 distribution to 60% cell phone in an effort to make sure that we're reaching the appropriate audience as Californians more and more become a cell phone only state. We interviewed just over 1,700 Californians, and that margin of error is about 3.3%. and about 1,100 likely voters with a margin of error of about 4%. So let's start off by looking at a snapshot of how Californians feel about the federal government. So about 1 in 3 Californians approve of the job that Donald Trump is doing as president, approve of the job that the U.S. Congress is doing, while about just shy of 6 in 10 Californians approve of the Supreme Court. There's a big partisan divide when it comes to President Trump especially, but also somewhat of a divide when it comes to opinions of the U.S. Congress. Specifically looking at President Trump, men are 10 points more likely than women to approve of President Trump, and Asian Americans and whites are twice as likely as Latinos and African Americans to approve of him. Compared to the nation, Californians are just about 15 points less likely to approve of President Trump than are Americans nationwide, according to a Gallup poll that was taken during the same time frame that we were in the field. Since then, I believe it's dropped a little bit, but during the time we were in the field, it was at 45%. Approval of Congress is lower across parties, and fewer than half across regions and demographic groups approve of Congress. And Californians in this case are somewhat more likely than adults nationwide to approve of Congress. Approval of the Supreme Court has actually increased 12 points since last May, with Republicans and independents being especially more approving. I would think that the double-digit increase among Republicans could be somewhat forward-looking, I would guess. We didn't ask a specific question about that, but there was a double-digit increase in approval of the Supreme Court, so that's quite interesting. So given that President Trump had been in office, beginning as early as 2 days when we began asking approval, we also wanted to have a couple of other ways to gauge Californians' opinions of President Trump. And we find that about 1 in 3 Californians have a favorable opinion of Donald Trump, and 6 in 10 view him unfavorably, with about half, just under half, having a strongly unfavorable opinion of President Trump. Favorable opinions of President Trump has actually increased by double digits among adults and likely voters since last January when he was a candidate. So since he's been elected, we've seen an increase. And there are big partisan differences evident, with fewer than 4 in 10 across regions and age, education, income groups holding favorable opinions of Donald Trump. There are differences across racial and ethnic groups, with whites much more likely than others to hold a favorable opinion. So another way that we wanted to kind of gauge opinions on Donald Trump is the idea of how much confidence Californians have in him to do what's right for the country's future. So when it comes to combining a great deal and a good amount, just under 3 in 10 Californians have confidence in Donald Trump, with just 9% of Democrats, while most Republicans have some confidence, and fewer independents do so. Once again, on both the favorable opinions and on the confidence, Californians are somewhat less likely than adults nationwide in a recent ABC News Washington Post poll. And so this is kind of consistent across all kind of the 3 ways that we've looked at President Trump, where about 3 in 10 or 1 in 3 kind of have a positive assessment, and assessments of him are more pessimistic in California than adults nationwide. So we've also looked at this idea of cooperation in a number of January surveys dating back all the way to, I think, 2008 or 2006. And we do this at both the state and national level. And today we find that despite the fact that we have a Republican elected president and a Republican Congress, just about half of Californians expect that President Trump and the U.S. Congress will be able to work together and accomplish a lot in the next year. Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to say that they expect productive collaboration, while just over half of independents hold this view. Notably, in January 2009, when President Obama and a Democratic Congress had just taken office, we found that 81% of Californians, including 2 in 3 Republicans, held a positive view about this idea of productive collaboration. So it's not just a partisan issue in this case, because I would say that in early 2009, the country was somewhat divided, but I think over the last, latter half of this decade, we've seen some divisions that have kind of grown apart, and I think that's part of what you're seeing here, where just half of Californians see the outlook for cooperation. So when it comes to the outlook for the nation, about 1 in 3 Californians think that that the nation is headed in the right direction, and about half expect good economic times. Optimism about the direction of the country was slightly higher in October, just prior to the election. And interestingly, while the overall perception really hasn't changed all that much, there's a dramatic shift among partisans on this question. Today we find that 6 in 10 Republicans say things are headed in the right direction. That's a 44-point increase since October. Regarding Democrats, today we find that 1 in 5 Democrats say that things are headed in the right direction. That's a 37-point decline since October. Still, fewer than 4 in 10 across regions and demographic groups say that the country is headed in the right direction. Regarding kind of the expectation of good economic times, a similar partisan pattern is evident there. Findings compared to October overall, mostly similar. But today, more than 8 in 10 Republicans expect good economic times. That's an increase of 56 percentage points. Today, about 4 in 10 Democrats expect good economic times. That's a decline of about 20 points. And so this idea that, elections kind of make a difference, at least in the perception of the overall mood of the nation, we've seen some really big dramatic change among partisans here. And I should add that we've also seen that at the state level when we've seen a change in leadership as well. So as President Trump took office, he acted swiftly to kind of make good on some of his campaign promises. One of those areas was in the idea of immigration reform, specifically ideas about sanctuary cities and enforcement. In kind of at the same time, we also saw the state government kind of have bills making their way through the legislature, or beginning to make their way through the legislature. We've seen localities like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland kind of say that they're going to make their own actions, or take their own actions to protect undocumented immigrants in their communities. So we wanted to ask kind of overall a question about how Californians feel about this idea of independent action separate from the federal government. And, we find that about 2 in 3 Californians say that they're in favor of the California state and local governments making their own policies and taking action separate from the federal government to protect the legal rights of undocumented immigrants. We find that 8 in 10 Democrats and 6 in 10 independents are in favor of this, while 7 in 10 Republicans are opposed. There is majority support across racial ethnic groups. However, as you can see, Latinos are the most likely to be in favor. We also find that a majority across regions, as well as age, education, and income groups, are in favor. And notably, support declines with rising age, where we find that 3 in 4 younger Californians are in favor, compared to just half of those who are 55 and older. And so this isn't just a partisan issue. This is definitely something that we can find other kind of dynamics there, specifically this idea of age. we did want to look beyond just the concept of enforcement and kind of look at the potential idea of immigration reform and how Californians are feeling about this. This is a question we've asked in the past, and we've consistently found that Californians thought that undocumented immigrants in the country should be allowed to stay if certain requirements are met, while few Californians feel that they should not be allowed to stay in the country legally. There are at least beginning conversations happening at the federal level regarding, early discussions about what could happen on this. But as you can see, there's big Democratic and Republican divide here. However, 2 in 3 Republicans in this case actually say that they should be allowed to stay in the country legally if certain requirements are met. So while almost all Democrats, it's still 2 in 3 Republicans. So there's bipartisan support for this issue. We find that among those who say they voted for Donald Trump, so kind of taking it a step further than Republicans, we find that 6 in 10 say that they should be allowed to stay, while about 1 in 3 say that they should not be allowed to stay. And so this is especially an issue of immigration that we'll continue to kind of monitor, especially in upcoming surveys regarding kind of what's happening with the travel ban as well as kind of other enforcement areas. So turning to another prominent topic that kind of was addressed early on in the Trump presidency, the Affordable Care Act, we find that about half of Californians continue to view the 2010 health reform law positively, as they have for about the last 2 years in periodic surveys. Democrats and Republicans offer opposing views, with 3 in 4 Democrats viewing the law favorably and 3 in 4 Republicans viewing it unfavorably. Fewer than half in the Central Valley and the Inland Empire and among whites view the law unfavorably. Fewer than half in the Central Valley and the Inland Empire have a favorable opinion, while those in other regions have or more favorable. Similar dynamics among whites and people of color, where whites are less likely than people of color to view the law favorably. Californians are somewhat more likely than adults nationwide, according to a January Kaiser Family Foundation poll, where 43% viewed the law favorably and 46% viewed it unfavorably. So just somewhat higher in favorable opinions. On the question of what should happen to the ACA, about half of Californians say that the law should not be repealed. Another 16% think that the law should be repealed immediately and work out the details of a plan later, while about 1 in 4 say they want to repeal the law but want to wait until the kind of details of a replacement plan have been introduced. A majority of Democrats and independents are against the idea of repeal, while a majority of Republicans only want to repeal once details have been announced. We find that majorities in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Los Angeles, and in Orange, San Diego say that Congress should not repeal the law, while about half in the Central Valley and Inland Empire favor repeal overall. Among those who approve of President Trump, 30% favor an immediate repeal, 43% favor repeal once an announcement plan is announced. So that's about 3 in 4 of those who approve of Donald Trump's job performance as president favor repeal. And adults nationwide are slightly more likely than Californians to favor repealing the law. So turning to another issue that we wanted to kind of see how Californians feel compared to the nation, this idea of climate change. So we asked a question that the Pew Research Center had asked in January about this idea of whether global climate change is a major threat, minor threat, or not a threat to the well-being of the United States. About 2 in 3 Californians think it's a major threat. About half of those interviewed in the Pew survey say it's a major threat. Most Democrats and 6 in 10 independents view global climate change as a major threat compared to about 1 in 4 Republicans. Majorities across regions call it a major threat, with San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles more likely than those in other areas to view it as a threat. We also find that majorities across racial ethnic groups say it is a threat, with whites being the least likely to hold this view. And beyond just the idea of whether or not global climate change is a threat, we wanted to kind of look at this idea of California doing its things on its own to address climate change. And what we found here is that, overall Californians have been supportive of this idea of California doing things on its own, and that's, kind of been in place since about 2005. And as you can see, across parties, Democrats have always been more likely than independents and much more likely than Republicans to favor this idea. However, what we've seen is that since July, we actually saw a 19-point drop in the perception among Republicans that the state should be doing things on its own, and we saw a double-digit increase among independents. So we saw independents become much more closely aligned to Democrats than Republicans on the issue of state action. We also see that majorities across regions and demographic groups are in favor, and among those who approve of President Trump, 1 in 3 are in favor and 2 in 3 are opposed. Now, when we look at both state action, independent state action on immigration and on addressing climate change, we find that about half of Californians are in favor of both of these ideas. And so that kind of speaks to how Californians view some of these issues, where California is diverging a bit from the national landscape. So as Congress considers President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, abortion policy is one central issue within the debate. As we have in the past, we find that strong majorities of Californians, as well as solid majorities across parties, say the government should not interfere with a woman's access to abortion. In fact, a solid majority of Californians have held this view since the first time we've asked this question in 2000. And so this is a long-held view, and it's one of the issues where there is partisan agreement on this. We also find that 6 in 10 Californians across age, education, and income groups say that government should not interfere with a woman's access to abortion. So specifically on the landmark Supreme Court case, we find basically a similar pattern here, where 7 in 10 Californians say that they do not want to completely see a complete overturn of Roe v. Wade. And since 2005, 2 in 3 Californians, at least 2 in 3 Californians have held this view. Once again, across parties, majorities say they do not want the ruling completely overturned. And we find that solid majorities across age, education, income, and racial and ethnic groups say they do not want the landmark case overturned. Compared to adults nationwide, Californians are similar. A Pew Research Center survey in December found that 69% of Americans do not want to see the law overturned. So now we'll shift to the state section. Kind of the first thing that we'll see is that approval ratings of our state elected officials are much higher than those at the national level. That's consistent with things that we generally find. However, this month we've actually seen a record high approval of Governor Brown, 62% approve. Approval of the state legislature is at its highest point since 2001. And this is with a 2/3 supermajority in the legislature at this time. I must say that if you look back over time, you kind of always see an increase in the numbers when it comes to January. And so we'll see where the governor and legislature are in March, but generally speaking, I'm not sure if it's a kind of optimistic view at the beginning of the year. But as you can see, each year, regardless of where it is, it's always a little bit higher in January. So that's really just something that's quite interesting from a survey standpoint. And in fact, we find that the governor has actually enjoyed majority approval in every survey dating back to April 2014. That's a running total of 20 consecutive surveys. Governor Brown has the approval of the overwhelming majority of Democrats, as well as 57% of independents. 2 in 3 Republicans disapprove of his job performance. We also see that regarding the state legislature, we find that their approval is at its highest point since 2001, and that 7 in 10 Democrats approve of the state legislature, while 1 in 5 Republicans do so. Interestingly, as we found in recent months, Republicans are actually more approving of the governor at 25% than they are of the legislature at 20%. And so that is, I think, quite interesting when it comes to the dynamics that are happening here in Sacramento. And in fact, today we find that 50% of Californians actually approve of both the governor and the legislature together. And so that's a pretty high mark when you consider that just 21% disapprove of both of them. And so that really speaks to kind of the high regard that Californians are viewing their state elected officials. And it's tied to the fact that a record high 66% of Californians actually think that the governor and the legislature will be able to work together and accomplish a lot. If you recall, 50% of Californians felt that way about President Trump in Congress. But as you might expect, there's a big partisan divide on this idea of productive collaboration, with 3 in 4 Democrats, 6 in 10 independents, compared to fewer than half Republicans who see this idea of productive collaboration occurring. When the governor took office in January 2011, things weren't, when he took office in January 2011, findings were similar. About 58% said that productive collaboration was likely. However, the following year, it dropped down to 44% in January 2012. But since then, it's been in the high 50s or low 60s. So since then, he said there's been the consistent pattern that Californians feel that productive collaboration is likely. Widespread held view with majorities of regions and demographic groups saying that the governor and legislature will accomplish a lot in 2017. Now, when it comes to which issue that Californians view as the most important for the legislature and the governor to work on, we find that jobs in the economy and immigration top the list, followed by education and schools, healthcare and health insurance. Last January, as you can see, water was a much bigger issue with 17%. It was actually the top issue last year. It's fallen down to number 5 this year. And it's actually dropped 11 points this year, which, as you can tell by the rain, perhaps the next time we ask about water will be viewed a different way as far as lack of, maybe a bit too much. And so Central Valley residents are twice as likely as others to view water as the top issue. Across parties, Democrats are more likely than others to mention education or health care, while Republicans are more likely to mention the state budget. Interestingly, kind of something that we noticed was compared to last year, we've seen an increase in the number of topics that are kind of eclipsing 2% this year. Last year, I believe we had like 17% other, meaning that things that didn't quite break 2%. This year, we actually saw 2% mentioning things like abortion, housing costs, as well as government in general, where 4% actually named government in general. I can say that having to do kind of some recodes on this topic, a good number of those people mentioning government in general specifically were mentioning Donald Trump or the federal government by name. And so that was about, I think, 1% last year mentioning government in general is kind of what should be worked on. It's kind of a weird thing to say that they should work on that since it's government itself. But that's what we found. So looking at the overall mood of Californians when it comes to the state, just under 6 in 10 say that the state is headed in the right direction. Just over half say that they expect good economic times. This was similar last January, and overall Californians have been optimistic about the overall mood of the state. And in fact, at least 4 in 10 Californians have said that the state is headed in the right direction and expect good economic times since December 2012. Majorities of Democrats hold positive perceptions on both dimensions. 3 in 4 Republicans are pessimistic about the direction of the state. But interestingly, a plurality of Republicans now expect good economic times at the state. And this optimism about the economic outlook marks the first time since January 2008 that more than 4 in 10 Republicans were optimistic about the economic direction of the state. And so that's kind of an overlap, I think, from what you saw at the national level regarding the optimism with Donald Trump as president. We've actually seen a pretty sizable increase in this positive perception among Republicans. Across racial ethnic groups, we find that Latinos and Asian Americans offer more positive assessments of both dimensions than African Americans and whites. And when we combine the answers to both of these, we find that 38% of Californians say that things are headed in the right direction and expect good economic times, while 20% of Californians are pessimistic on both of these. Compared to the nation, we found that about 30% were optimistic about both in that case. So not a large disparity there like we saw on the approval. So Governor Brown recently proposed his state budget for the 2017-18 fiscal year, and that included, about $122 billion in general fund expenditures. As most of you probably know, the top spending area in the budget is K-12 education, followed by health and human services, higher education, and corrections and rehabilitation. However, when we ask the general public, as you can see, we find that about 4 in 10 Californians think that prisons and corrections is the largest area of the state budget. Just 16% correctly identify K-12 public education as the top spending area. However, when we ask Californians what they think should be the highest priority in the state budget, 44% say that K-12 education should be the highest priority. And of course, this matches up with the actual priorities that are set forth in the budget. In both, we also see that about 30% say health and human services. And so in this case, about 74% get the top 2 categories right. So that's not too bad when it comes to the priorities that are being set. Democrats are much more likely to incorrectly name prisons and corrections as the top spending area, while pluralities of Republicans and independents name health and human services as the top spending area. And so that kind of goes to what type of government people view. And so we wanted to ask also about the preference for the size of government. So it's just a general question that forces people into a choice of would they rather pay higher taxes and have a state government that provides more services, or pay lower taxes and have a state government that provides fewer services. Just about half of Californians and likely voters say that they would prefer a higher taxes and more services. Big Democrat-Republican divide here, with kind of independents divided amongst themselves. This preference for a larger government is more common in the San Francisco Bay Area than in other areas, and among those under 35 compared to older Californians, as well as among people of color compared to whites. And so this is a question that we've asked pretty consistently about once a year since I've been at PPIC, and generally speaking, about half say that they prefer a larger government. But it's often closely divided as is today. So it's not that California views itself as a place that necessarily wants this larger government by a widespread margin. So regarding the state budget situation, despite the fact that the governor has put forth a budget that has a budget deficit, a record low share of Californians actually view the state budget situation as a big problem. And what we see is that while fewer than 4 in 10 Democrats and independents view the budget as a big problem, 6 in 10 Republicans hold this view. Fewer than half across regions and age and education and income groups call the budget a big problem. Notably, African Americans are much more likely than others to say it's a big problem. I recall, a time where, if we took this a little bit further back, the number would actually be, about 8 in 10 were saying that the budget is a big problem at the kind of height of the kind of budget crunch that we were having. And so to be at 37% today is quite a change from both when the governor took office in 2011 and beyond, when it was much higher. And I would come here and be briefing about the state budget situation in September, as opposed to the normal routine that we had prior to that, where it was just kind of January and May, check in on the budget. And so hopefully we're back to those days. Now, regarding the governor's proposal, despite having a record high approval rating right now and the belief that they'll work together and accomplish a lot, the budget that the governor recently proposed is favored by fewer than half. So he put forth a budget plan to close the deficit by slowing spending growth in K-14 education and in other areas, by eliminating some planned one-time spending. The plan itself includes modest increases in the largest areas of the state budget, such as K-14 education, higher education, health and human services, and prisons and corrections, and also putting just about $1 billion in the state's rainy day fund. And so there's slim majority support among Democrats and those in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as college graduates, Asian Americans, and Latinos, but fewer than half elsewhere actually favor his budget plan. And so that will be interesting as we kind of move forward to the May revise and to the eventually signing of the budget, to see how kind of Californians come around to this idea of his spending proposal. Within his budget, he also included a transportation funding proposal. This plan would address a multi-billion-dollar shortfall in California infrastructure improvements. He's proposing about $43 billion in additional spending, and this would be funded through a $65 fee on all vehicles, an increase in the gasoline excise tax, as well as an increase in the diesel tax, as well as using some cap and trade money to fund this plan. This receives lower favor than his overall plan, with about 4 in 10 Californians and likely voters saying they favor this idea. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to be in favor, while independents are more divided. And support for this proposal actually only eclipses 50% among San Francisco Bay Area residents, Asian Americans, and college graduates. So there's finding majority support is not that easy when it comes to this transportation plan. However, that doesn't mean that Californians aren't viewing this idea of spending money on transportation as important. we find that nearly all Californians view spending more money on the maintenance of California's roads, highways, and bridges as important to the quality of life and economic vitality of California's future, with 6 in 10 calling it very important. This is a consistent finding across regions and 2 in 3 across parties. Sorry about that. And we actually also see support across parties for the idea that it's very important. And this is something that we've also found in recent years, that this kind of disconnect between the idea of kind of the actual spending the money versus the kind of concept of how important it actually is. And we also asked about how Californians think we will be able to significantly improve the quality of surface transportation. About half of Californians, when asked the question where they're forced into one of these 3 categories, half say that using existing funds more wisely would lead to this quality, while about 4 in 10 say that there both needs to be a wiser use of the funds as well as more money. Just 7% of Californians say that it just needs to be an increase in the funding. So most Californians view that there needs to be at least some efficiencies in the way that the money is being spent. Majorities of Republicans and Independents say that wiser use alone is needed, while about half of Democrats say that both wiser use of existing funding and additional funding is needed. I would encourage you to kind of look at the transportation just effects that we have, because I'm not going to get into all the questions that we asked, but in general, when it comes to how Californians want to increase transportation funding, we find that more Californians are in favor of the idea of bond money than they are of local taxes, which would fund local roads. And so I encourage you to take a deeper dive there when it comes to kind of some of the finer details on transportation, because there's a lot that we covered in this survey, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about it here today. So in conclusion, about 1 in 3, regardless of how we ask the question, offer positive assessments of President Trump. Despite the idea that there is a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican president, only about half of Californians think that Congress and President Trump will be able to work together and accomplish a lot. Solid majorities of Californians want independent state action to protect the rights of undocumented immigrants and to address global warming. On the idea of the Affordable Care Act, a slim majority of Californians both view the law favorably and do not want to see it repealed. At the state level, a record high share of Californians approve of Governor Brown and think that the legislature and he will be able to work together and accomplish a lot. However, despite that, fewer than half approve of the governor's budget proposal or his transportation plan. So kind of setting up a disconnect there. So at this point, I will open it up to questions. I do ask that raise your hand and we'll get some with the microphone so that we can hear everyone's questions. Thank you.
I have just 2 quick questions. One, I saw that obviously Republicans are much more enthusiastic about our president. If you compare that to how Democrats were in 2009 at this time, and if you go back as 2001, Republicans to Bush, is it similar numbers?
I would say that the pattern is similar. I don't know the exact numbers, but I do know that Californians were optimistic overall. So it was at a higher point at that time when President Obama took office. I think our first reading was in March of that year, and it was in the high 60s to low 70s. So it was a higher starting point, but there was more kind of overall approval among Democrats. So I'd say there was probably at similar level. Going back 2001, that's a little bit before my time. We do have information on that online.
Okay.
But I've just been here since 2005, so I wouldn't want to misspeak on
And then just
something
real
I'm not
quickly
that
on
familiar with.
second question,
Yes.
on immigration, when was the last time that issue had resonated so much with respondents?
It depends on what you mean in regards to kind of. Yeah, so I would say that, so this question is slightly different because it's what the governor and legislature are going to work on. But in the past, the idea of immigration being the most important issue in the state, it has been near the top, but I'm not exactly sure on that. But we do have time trends on our website, which would allow you to kind of look at that question over time, or shoot me an email as well. Yes, right here.
Hi, on transportation, curious why the question was asked about bonds to fund transportation, because as far as I know, nobody in the last 2 years has been talking about more bonds since we're paying off the current transportation bonds out of transportation money. So it's cannibalizing the available money.
Yes. Well, I think it's an area that we've asked about in the past, and so as we kind of move forward, local taxes is actually one option that's been kind of put forth. But in the past, we've also asked about bonds because if we ask a kind of question about how Californians would prefer to pay for them, and we offer like 5 choices, most Californians do prefer, and so we just want to get a yearly reading on kind of how Californians feel about this idea, because of the fact that the last time we asked about the transportation plan more generally, there wasn't a whole lot of support, and so while it's not being discussed, that could potentially be an option that later down the road, if there isn't some agreement on the topic, but it is something that we know isn't necessarily as part of the vibrant discussion that will likely be taking place in later this year. Yes.
So on the Affordable Care Act, when you asked the question about the Affordable Care Act, whether to repeal or replace it, or just
Yes.
kind of fix it, under that question, did you talk about, was there any chance to ask about Medicare for all? Whether, when the Democrats came up about it, did they talk about having Medicare for all, a single payer or anything like that?
So that's just a question that we provide 3 choices for, and so in general, those are kind of put into choices. It is an area of exploration that as kind of as things shake out, that we're going to kind of be coming back to, with potential for other types of ideas or proposals that could be discussed as we move forward. Also looking at, with the ACA, one of the biggest issues is what will California do if it's actually repealed, and so that's something that we're going to try to come back to. But at this point in time, we just wanted to kind of get how do Californians feel about the idea overall. But as things, take shape one way or the other, I'm sure this is the area of exploration that we'll be coming back to. Yes. Yes.
Back on transportation, found it interesting. There were those numbers. I think 90-some% of Californians said we should be spending more money on transportation, whereas the governor's specific proposal, I don't know if that was the governor's or the legislature's proposal, but was considerably less. And you can sort of resolve that dissonance fairly easily, saying, generally want to spend more, but maybe not in that particular way. Yeah. What I found a little bit more interesting was the other question that you asked about spending more money versus using existing funds more efficiently as the only way. And I thought you said 51% said use existing funds more efficiently as the primary or only way. I have a harder time reconciling that with 95% saying spend more money, with 51% saying just use the existing funds.
Yeah.
As a researcher, can you reconcile that, or is it just a dissonance that doesn't make any sense?
I think if you ask people on a number of issues, generally speaking, they would probably say that, we need to spend money to do this. but when you really push them on either how it should be spent or could this be addressed a different way, they may actually have kind of other views. I plan on taking a look at some of the crosstabs there to see kind of, looking at kind of where some of this dissonance is at, because it is, yeah. I mean, but even if there were 61% that said it was very important to spend money, but 51% said that it was, so only if you only look at the very important, there's still a disconnect. But if you combine them for very and somewhat, there's this huge disconnect. And so that's something that we hope to be able to kind of pull apart in future surveys and by looking into the crosstabs on this specific survey, because it is, very interesting. But I guess if I ask you if you want, free pizza, you may say yes, but when it comes to the specifics of the pizza, there may be more disagreement about that.
It might be easier to reconcile if it was, if you hadn't given that third option of saying both.
Yes.
If you gave that option of
Yeah.
both, and it would seem like that was a hugely popular.
Well, 4 and 10 said both, and so 51% said only, and so that kind of captured most of the people. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Just wait 1 second.
Okay, so this had to do with cap and trade. Right,
Yes.
so it looks like to me that California and its government is not too crazy about cap and trade here. So I'm assuming, but I'd like to have you stretch out the question a little further and says, would cap and trade affect global warming? Or global warming and cap and trade, because that's kind of reasons why we're having cap and trade. And they said if cap and trade was to go away, I'd like to see how that would affect that and whether you wanted to keep it for that purpose.
Yeah, well, cap and trade is an interesting topic, especially at this point in California. It's something we'll be coming back to later in the year, and we'll be specifically addressing in our annual environment survey, most likely that will be happening in July. And so, but yeah, California with cap and trade, there are going to be lots of discussions in the coming year. So, but I'd like to thank you all for coming and spending some of your Valentine's Day with us today, and have a great rest of your day.